So today we're going to talk about connectivity for tigers in central India. Our session moderator is Gary Tabor. Gary is the president and founder of Center for Large Landscape Conservation. And he has 30 years of experience doing large landscape conservation across different continents, including Africa, South America. And we know that Gary is very involved in India now as well. He's been a friend of NCCI for a few years now, after being the keynote at our last stills in Melghat, which if you've been to, you would remember. And we're also going to have 3 talks. Jay is going to talk about the science behind connectivity in central India. I'm going to present a little bit about the stakeholders that are here and how complicated central India is in terms of a stakeholder group with many important issues there. Mr. Hemant Kamdi is here from the NTCA, the National Tiger Conservation Authority, and he will present on the vision for central India and especially the role of new protected areas that are coming up in central India. After which, we're also going to have a panel. Our panelists are great people. Kishore, who's been part of the NCCI journey for many years now, who's the founder of Satpura Foundation. Dr. Sandeep Tambe, who's a professor at IIFM, the Indian Institute for Forest Management, and Dr. Sejal Vora, who's the program director of WWF India, who also closed SILS Melghat, the last SILS that we had. So with that, I would like to call on Gary, if you would like to join as the video, and I will turn off mine. And I will also stop sharing this and we can continue.
Thank you, Amrita. Thank you everyone for attending. Thank you to the organizers of the Network for Central India, Conserving Central India. It's so great to be with you all here together again. I'm sorry we can't do this in person. And we were supposed to be in Kanha. This was supposed to be number 4. And the fact that it's number 4 represents the continuity and interest and support and the growing support for conserving the biodiversity of this landscape and for sustaining the livelihoods of the people who are the stewards of this landscape. So thank you all for joining. Today's session is on connectivity in the central Indian landscape for tigers, what's at stake for conserving tigers in central India, and I put it to you, what's at stake for the world? Because in conserving tigers in central India, it's a world phenomenon. So this is important, and it's about connectivity. It's not that we want to have tigers being able to speak better on their cell phones together, but we want this connectivity, which we call ecological connectivity, that tigers can maintain their livelihoods amidst and coexist with the livelihoods of people. And we have a great session today with 3 presentations followed by an interactive panel. So what you're going to see today, these 3 presentations to begin with, are the culmination of a working group focused specifically on connectivity that was organized at our last conference in Melghat. Our speakers will present on the science and the inferences of management of that science and how that may provide information on current and future protected area management within this landscape. So now I'd like to introduce the 3 panelists now who will give 3 presentations. That's J. Michael Schoen from Columbia University, followed by Amrita, who is the coordinator for the Network for Conserving Central India, and Mr. Hemant Kamdi, who's Assistant Inspector General of Forests for the National Tiger Conservation Authority in the regional office in Nagpur. So let me turn it over to Jay. Thank you all again for attending.
Thank you so much. Let me just share my screen real quick. All right, thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you to everyone for being here at this great event. As Gary said, my name is Jay Schoen. I'm a PhD student working with Ruth DeFries at Columbia University in New York City, and I'm extremely humbled and grateful for the opportunity to contribute to the important work taking place in Central India. Today, I'm really excited to share some results from a project that builds upon an excellent body of research on tigers across this landscape. And first and foremost, this work has been a true team effort. In that light, I'd like to thank all of our collaborators up front for your contributions and invaluable feedback throughout this project. Now, tigers, of course, are an important flagship and umbrella species that occupy an important ecological niche throughout their range. Unfortunately, this range has come under fire in the last few hundred years, has been reduced drastically, with estimates of less than 4,000 individuals remaining in the wild. Now, zooming into Central India, which is a global priority tiger landscape, where it's estimated that 57% of the world's remaining tigers are now living, and a third of these are living outside of protected areas. Central India also, of course, is a multi-use region. It's heavily human dominated, with a lot of competition for space and resource between humans and wildlife. Now, this points out the importance of connectivity, and several studies recently have found that tigers, in spite of all these threats and this competition for resources, have been able to maintain a rather high level of gene flow and connectivity between protected areas throughout Central India. Accordingly, over the last 8 years or so, several groups have set out to understand exactly how these populations have connected in the past, are connected now, and how we can conserve these areas to make sure they maintain healthy genetic exchange and ecological health throughout the future. And the authors of these 5 studies in particular were kind enough to share their data as part of this collaboration. So when we looked at these 5 studies on the surface, what they did is they made what are called resistance surfaces. And resistance surfaces characterize the landscape based on how suitable areas are for movement, in this case, tiger movement. So in all 5 of these maps, these are all separate maps here, the blue is representing low resistance, where there is a high likelihood that a tiger will be able to move through an area easily. The red, on the other hand, is high resistance, which is representative of areas where tigers have a harder time moving through an area. So when you look at these 5 studies, first and foremost, they look really different on the surface. And in terms of management and giving a clear message to managers, that's not great news. It doesn't mean anything is wrong with the studies, but we want to have a clear, digestible result for management so we can give them a clear path forward. So we thought in order to advise managers, we want to quantify how much these studies agree and where they agree so we can give this clear, digestible result. So the first thing we did is we took a look at the methodology behind these 5 studies. And what we found is that when they were creating their resistance surfaces, they had several things in common. First of all, they all used land use and land cover to classify the landscape. They all also used some measure of human impact. However, they were carried out at a variety of spatial extents and resolutions. They used different specific land use and land cover data, and they also quantified human impact in different ways between the 5 of them. Some of the studies also use metrics such as prey availability and genetic data for these maps. So this led us to 3 main questions going into this study. We want to know, first of all, to what extent do these results on connectivity mapping agree on A, the resistance to tiger movement in the landscape, or what we're calling habitat quality, and then B, areas of high connectivity. So how much do they agree on the connectivity, the high movement areas through the landscape, which we're going to call corridors. And then secondly, within these agreement corridors, who are the stakeholders, who will be affected by any decisions made here, and who are the governmental agencies responsible for making some of these decisions? And then finally, also looking into this umbrella species concept, trying to understand what other species and ecosystem services may also be protected if we save these areas. My part of the talk is just going to focus on this first question here. So jumping right into resistance to tiger movement in the landscape, finding out how much these maps agree on general habitat quality. So looking at these once again, as I said, they look really different on the surface. And one of those reasons is that they cover different extents. So the first thing we needed to do was to put these all on the same page. So we used the common extent between the 5 layers, and we also displayed them in the same visual way. And so when we did that, you can see they actually look even more different than before because the color schemes are all the same and they're covering the same area now. So once again, we just needed to find a way to compare them. It doesn't matter, they look different here. We can still find some agreement amongst them. However, because they do look so different, once again, blue being low resistance and some of the maps being almost all blue with a little red, some being all red with a little blue. Because of this, it really precluded the use of traditional metrics of agreement, such as looking at an average and a standard deviation. And so what we chose to do was to discretize, to break each of these maps into 5 discrete quantiles or 5 categories of resistance. So 1 being the lowest resistance, blue still, 5 being highest resistance in red. And this is so that low resistance in one map corresponds to low resistance in another map. High resistance corresponds to high resistance in another map. And you can already see they're starting to look a bit more comparable between the 5 of them. This also allowed us to do 2 more important things. We could now look at the mode value of resistance of these quantiles between the 5 layers. And so this is showing that here on the left. The second thing it allowed us to do was look at the percentage agreement on this mode value. So whatever it says on the left, on the right is showing how many layers, what percentage of layers agreed that that was the mode value for this map. The darker colors on the right mean that there's a higher percentage agreement. And when looking at the results of these maps quantitatively, a few things stand out. First of all, going into the higher agreement areas, these are increasingly high and low resistance. So increasingly blue and red proportionally as you get to these high agreement areas. In the lower agreement areas, you're getting a lot more of this middle resistance, the orange, the yellow, and the green areas where there's lower agreement throughout the map. And we thought this makes sense because likely what's happening is the studies are all agreeing on where areas are either really good for tiger movement or really bad for tiger movement. But in between, these areas are a little bit less clear. To get a better idea of what was happening here, we took a look at the land cover underneath these data sets. And what we found when we did this was our hypothesis was confirmed in a way that as we're increasing in percentage agreement here, we're seeing increasing levels of forest and settlements, so these kind of optimal and non-optimal habitats for tiger movement. And then in between there, we're seeing lower levels. As you go up in agreement, you're seeing lower levels of agricultural areas and scrub forests, these kinds of suboptimal or not as well understood habitats. And this could be coming from a variety of sources. First of all these maps, as I said, use different measures of land use and land cover, which could contribute to it. But I think more importantly, what this is saying is that the way that animals and tigers move through these areas is still not very well understood, and accordingly is a hot area of research right now. So regardless of that, we were able to conclude that we have this mode value of habitat quality throughout this region. However, it's important to keep in mind the percentage agreement of these areas when we're looking at this map. So for our second piece, we wanted to look at areas of high connectivity for tiger movement, what we're calling corridors. So once again, we started with these raw resistance maps. This is before splitting them into the quantiles. And we ran a program called CircuitScape over them. And what CircuitScape does is it treats each map as a circuit board and runs pulses of electricity throughout that board, with the end result being where there's more current flow in the end, simulates where we think there might be more movement by the animals. So looking at the results here, in yellow are the hotter areas where there's more current flow or more predicted movement. Purple and black are the darker areas where there is less movement predicted. And what you can see already is there seems to be a bit more agreement. Just spatially looking at these maps, despite the differences in the resistance maps, running CircuitScape over them leads to a result that's a lot more comparable. And that meant that we could use more traditional summary metrics here. So what we did is after scaling these maps to all match each other, we were able to take an average value of the 5, and then to look at agreement, we looked at a measure of variance called the coefficient of variation. And this basically looks at the lower the coefficient of variation, the higher the agreement. So once again, on the right here, this map is showing the darker areas is where there's more agreement. And right away, when you look at these darker areas, you'll see that there is a large amount of overlap between the dark areas and the high current flow areas. And we thought this was good news because it's showing that despite the difference in the maps initially, they're still showing that current flow, areas of high current flow, high predicted movement are in relative agreement. So the first thing we did is we wanted to mask out the areas where there wasn't much agreement. So just look at where we know that there is current flow in this map, where these studies agree. But then to get an idea of corridors, we had to look at the highest percentiles of movement here because we wanted to know where movement was not only agreed upon, but where there might be high amounts of movement. So what we did is we split this into several layers based on percentile cutoffs of this agreement current flow. So we started by looking at the 60th percentile, then the 70th percentile, the 80th, and the 90th. And we compared each one of these layers to a set of conflict data generously provided by Trishna. And we tried to see which one of these layers matched this data set the best, which one captured these points the best. And what we found is that the 70th percentile cutoff did the best job of this. So we're moving forward with this, calling this our agreement corridor layer, the 70th percentile cutoff of agreement corridors. And we want to stress here that by no means is this the one map to rule them all, right? This is just the best that we can gather from these five wonderful studies, the best we can say about what they agree upon, where they agree there will be high predicted movement throughout this landscape. So in summary, in terms of habitat quality, we found that that there was high agreement in high and low resistance areas, but lower agreement in these middle resistance areas, once again pointing out the importance of these agricultural and scrub forest areas for further study. As far as corridors, we saw this high agreement and high predicted movement area, so the overlap between the dark and the yellow colors. And we also found the 70th percentile cutoff was a good cutoff for next steps. And we want to stress again that we're recommending further validation, that these agreement corridors should be validated, preferably with tiger movement data between protected areas, even with dispersing individuals if possible, before anything happens on the ground. So next steps, as I mentioned before, are to look at who are the stakeholders within these areas. And that's what Amrita is going to be talking about immediately following my presentation. And then areas of further study we're hoping to look into next are to understand more about this umbrella species concept. If we protect these areas for tigers, what else might we be protecting in terms of species and also in terms of ecosystem services? So that was a lot of information in a short amount of time. I want to thank you for bearing with me. Thanks again for being here. Thank you to all the collaborators. Again, this is really a wonderful collaborative effort, and I'm honored to be a part of it. I'll turn it over for questions. Please don't be shy. Approach me any way you want in this, this wonderful platform. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Jay. Amrita?
Thanks, Gary. I'm going to start my screen share, and then we can go from there. So for the next step, what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about who are the stakeholders in this landscape, and also how do we realize connectivity in a complicated landscape like Central India. So as I said, I'm going to start from where Jay stopped, and I'm going to talk about how the two layers that he used largely to form at the end of his presentation, one which shows areas of low resistance, that's the one on the top right corner, where, and I'm going to use the layer of the current flow. So I'm going to look at those two layers underneath those spaces which are connectivity, are important for connectivity, who lives there, who works there, and who might be the stakeholder group. As Jay mentioned, there's going to be further study about other aspects related to connectivity in Central India, especially to do with what are the species might be using these areas for connectivity, and also what else do they provide to people who live there. As Jay also mentioned, this is a large outcome from a working group that started 2 years back at the previous SILS. And I would like to thank everyone involved and for all the time we have spent together to get at this point. So first, I'd like to talk about land ownership, and I'd like to talk about who owns the land in important areas for connectivity, or what we're calling corridors. As you can see, as this is an example of one of 3 states across Central India, Madhya Pradesh, it's a mosaic of villages. And what you can see over here is that across this mosaic of villages are embedded protected areas. Now, to look at the stakeholders in corridor areas, I used the low resistance layer. And I then also used the forest department layers to show you overlap. So you can see that people and forest lands are intermingled. There's also the fact that this is down to the lowest unit of the land parcels. So if you look at a single village, or if you look at a single forest department compartment, this is also the case. There is great overlap in land ownership. So many different government arms might own the same piece of land, and many in there might be revenue lands, might be private holdings, might even be different government arms like defense land as compared to forest lands. And one other point that I want to make here is that in this human-dominated landscape, within areas that are important for connectivity, corridors, the human density is not at its peak. So it's got lower human density in corridor areas as compared to areas outside of corridors. Although, having said that, we don't know yet whether corridors are an attractant, so will there be in-migration, or if corridors are a deterrent, and will there be out-migration from corridors. We also checked this across 3 states, and we found that this exists across corridor areas across the 3 states, that village populations within corridors are significantly lower than village populations outside of corridors. So let's talk about how do we manage those areas that are populated by villages, have forest, have wildlife, using those areas to get from one protected area to the next. And in this, I would like to talk about how there are many different activities that happen in the corridors. We know there is conservation work, there is protected area management in this work. And we know that the forest department has protected area staff within protected areas. There's also territorial departments outside of protected areas. Government forest commercial activity also exists in this area with the Forest Development Corporation that largely consists of plantation and timber work. There's also the NTFP corporations, which are non-timber forest produce corporations. And these are very important also to the livelihoods of people in this area. As you can see here on the slide, 33 lakhs, more than 33 lakhs of Tendu collectors are in MP alone. And Tendu, just to explain here, is a leaf that is commercially extracted from these forests to make BDs in, which are small rolled cigarettes that are locally sold. And also the forest department involves communities. There has been a history of understanding that areas require management with people, since this is quite a populated place. There is the forest villages, the villages that are assigned forests or have been designated as forest dwelling villages. There's joint forest management for blocks of forest within buffers of protected areas. And largely across the landscape, across corridor areas, there's also the thorny issue of FRA, so that's the Forest Rights Act. And how do people and protection for wildlife coexist? So this is in terms of the management. I also want to talk about other stakeholders in this, apart from the managers of forests. And over here, I want to talk specifically about infrastructure. So we all know this, at least this audience clearly is already a part of many sort of programs on this, which is that where we have mineral ore in India is also where a lot of times we have standing forest. And so forest land outside of protected areas is diverted to other uses, and this can happen formally. You can also see here in the red that Maharashtra, Chhattisgarh, and Madhya Pradesh, the 3 states in central India, largely, are also the ones where there is a tremendous amount of forest land diversion. These are figures from 2019. A lot of this forest is also diverted for linear infrastructure, and we know as barriers to movement, linear infrastructure are very important to consider in a wildlife landscape. So maybe roads, transmission lines, and increasingly irrigation are focuses where we should really pay attention to what's going on. What does this look like? What does this look like for all of us in central India? So you can see that road crossings across the landscape cut across corridors here in the light green in the background. And upwards of 5 road crossings are across each of these corridors on average. So you can imagine that tigers moving from one park to another have not just the villages to deal with, but also these really difficult to cross barriers like roads. It is similar for rail, but in the sense that rails are sparser across this landscape. However, I do not know whether roads are worse than rails for tigers, and that is something we should keep in mind as we go forward. Transmission lines also cover this landscape, and you can see that they cross these corridors in many places. However, transmission lines being aerial, we need to know whether the clear felling that follows the path of transmission lines is going to be problematic for tigers, and what sort of barriers do they cause. There's also mining activity within this area, and if you look at this map, 28% of all the orange dots that signify mines would fall into the connectivity areas or would fall into corridors. So that's how I want to talk about the stakeholders in terms of industry. And the main conclusions of my talk are largely that within corridors, forest land overlaps with other government and private land holding. So clearly there is a very complicated situation on the ground of who owns a specific piece of land. In many cases outside of protected areas, this translates to something known as orange areas, where the revenue department and the forest department both claim ownership of the land. In terms of management, in central India is human dominated, and even within corridors, it's just village after village after village. However, as we saw, within the corridors, villages are less populated than the villages outside. It remains to be seen whether this means that people will move into corridors or move out of corridors. Corridors are, of course, hugely important for local livelihoods as a large agrarian community. The NTFP collection or extraction commercially from the forests provides a stable income seasonally for people to do more with their livelihoods. And the numbers here really suggest that to remove one of these livelihoods by higher protection would have to be considered a great deal. And corridors, of course, face acute land competition from multiple stakeholders. Here, I want to talk about industry again, about how the crisscrossing of this landscape is very important to consider. And really, all of these points bring me to one final takeaway from this presentation, which is the need for coordination amongst multiple stakeholders. And we see the beginning of that in groups like this, where we're considering it, but we'd like to expand further. And also here, I'd like to talk about this point in a little bit of detail, which is to say that these siloed workings are actually legacies. Many government arms and many disciplines of scientific research worked independently. And now we see more and more interdisciplinary work. We see more departmental coordination. And so now it's a legacy that is changing. And I really want to be part of it. And I hope a lot of other people want to be part of it. Because I think once we get a group of stakeholders actually talking to each other is when we can begin to plan better for wildlife and for people in Central India. With that, I'd like to thank a whole bunch of people. Of course, the people who are part of the working group. We've been working at this for 2 years, so it's really nice to see how far we've come, what agreement we've found, how we're viewing the complications on the ground. There's also collaborations coming out of this work that you'll hear about over the conference. I'd also like to thank a few other people who fed into the work that I did for this presentation and for this project. I'd like to thank the MP Forest Department who shared their forest boundaries so that we could get a clearer view of what's happening on the ground between forest boundary jurisdictions and local village jurisdictions. I'd also like to thank Venkat, who from ATRI, who had many conversations with me about the Hindu trade and really gave me a clear view of what is going on. I'd like to thank Rakesh Singh, who works at LIFE, which is the legal body that pulled all of this data on the different forest diversions that have happened since 2019. And also I'd like to thank other data sources like India Under Construction. And of course, you might have noticed a lot of the Gonda art on my presentation. So I'd like to thank the Gold artists for that as well. Thank you. And I will wait for the next presentation to end and we can go into questions after.
Thank you, Amrita. That's fantastic. What I like with connectivity conservation, you're not just connecting species across the landscape, you're connecting people to save landscape, to save nature. Both these presentations have done a great job of seeing the network of collaborators to bring the science to you. Our final presentation is from Hemant Kamdi from the National Tiger Conservation Authority. Hemant, it's all yours.
Thank you. So good evening again from India, and it was very pleasant to hear two speakers earlier. As you are all aware, topic of my presentation would be tiger corridors in central India, particularly focusing on the legal protection they enjoy. How do we delineate at NTCA level, and a role of new protected area, which have already came up in these networks, or otherwise the areas which are potential for this to be declared as new protected area. So here we go. In the beginning, let me tell you that Wildlife Protection Act is umbrella legislation for wildlife conservation and wildlife habitat protection in India. As per Wildlife Protection Act, we don't have any provision or section there for notification of corridors, just the way we notify protected areas like wildlife sanctuaries and national parks. But we need not to worry about this, because once after the amendment in 2006, still we don't have any section for the notification, but we still have sufficient legal backing for conservation of corridors. And what is that? So legal backing to this is in form of the powers which are given to National Tiger Conservation Authority in the Act. Conservation Authority is empowered to approve tiger conservation plan, which is, we can say, like Bible of tiger reserve management, which is to be prepared under, again, same act by the concerned state government, and which is a mandatory activity for tiger reserve and concerned state government as well as NTCA. So what do we have in this tiger conservation plan? Along with core and buffer, we have corridor or adjoining area plan, where we delineate all these tiger corridors. And since it is a legal document, it has surrogate legal backing. Along with that, NTCA is also empowered to assess and disallow any ecological and sustainable activity, not only in tiger reserve area, but also in tiger corridors. So NTCA gives technical input to NBWL, National Board for the Wildlife, which is apex organization for wildlife conservation in India, to decide on the wildlife matters. It gives technical input on any unsustainable land use in corridor area, and decision on wildlife clearance for the diversion purpose or any other purpose is taken based on the NTCA's technical advice. Apart from that, NTCA is also specially empowered to give direction to any person, officer or authority which is legally binding to them. And taking leverage of this provision, NTCA has developed certain MOUs and guidelines with the state government and guidelines for the state governments for restoration and protection of the corridor. So even though corridors are not notifiable, we do have sufficient legal support for the conservation or protection of the corridor. How do we actually delineate then? After 2006 and 2010 exercise of All India Tiger Estimation, data there was used using list cost for preparing list cost pathways and wider circuitscapes. So what you are seeing in the map, these are the macro level list cost pathways. Along with that, we do have circuitscape current this one pathways also. The same pathways are provided in the same report called Connecting Tiger Population for Long-Term Conservation by NTC and Wildlife Institute of India. It has forest as well as non-forest area, and average 3 kilometer wide for this, particularly for this least cost pathways. So after having this macro level pathways, we observed like actual dispersal of tiger in different tiger reserves or source area is also following maybe approximately to these least cost pathways. Once these least cost pathways and circuitscapes were prepared in a report, this report along with direction was communicated to the state government to incorporate these least cost pathways in corridor plan of tiger conservation plan, minimum, at least bare minimum. After that, state governments were requested to delineate macro level or do fine tuning of these least cost pathways and delineate corridors in the respective TCPs of tiger corridor. So responding to that, tiger reserves like Tadoba Tiger Reserve, they have prepared a layer of corridor at compartment or beat level, incorporating most of the tiger area surrounding Tadoba Tiger Reserve. And there is a rider like long-term connectivity study is ongoing. Once this study is concluded, we can fine-tune these corridors. But then till then, this is the corridor what it looks like for the Tadoba Tiger Reserve. Certain tiger reserves like Pench Tiger Reserve and Kanha Tiger Reserve in central part of the India, they used again this least cost and circuitscape theories. Apart from that, they have used their own discretion also to delineate or find new pathways and incorporate them into corridor plan. Some tiger reserves like Melghat and Pench, they just notionally demarcated that, I mean, without getting into this one GIS or administrative level of compartment or beat or range or declaring at that level, they just drew a kind of indicative pathway which tigers they do follow as corridor for movement from one area to another area. There are other corridors by appropriate authority but this is again single known example of micro level delineation of corridor by any state government. So this is East Vidarbha Landscape Corridor Atlas developed by the state government of Maharashtra with Wildlife Institute of India, and it is being used to assess and disallow any unsustainable activity coming up in this eastern part of the Maharashtra. One more I am aware about is corridor map as developed by the Wildlife Conservation Trust. My dear friend Mr. Milind and Aditya, they shared it with me. So how do we manage these corridors? I mean, there is a usually belief in people these things are not happening, grasslands are not being developed in corridor area, large scale water bodies are not being developed in the corridor area for the tigers. So we avoid such activities because we don't want corridors to be optimal habitat. We want it at suboptimal level, because accommodating breeding wildlife population in a high density in corridor area can create conflict for the future. We cannot develop it like a core zone area of the tiger reserve. As we have seen in earlier presentations, there is an ocean of humanity just surrounding these corridors and protected areas. So we want them just to pass from the one area to other area. And by the way, NTC also funds to areas outside tiger reserve for conservation of tiger, which includes even these corridor areas. And we do have check on do's and don'ts, to let it be corridor and not a habitat like core area in tiger reserve. Now, something which I would like to highlight before getting into my next part of presentation, Chhattisgarh, Madhya Pradesh and Maharashtra, if you look at the forest distribution or forest patch size, as the patch size increases to the tune of 1,000 square kilometer to 5,000 square kilometer, 5,000 to 10,000 square kilometer, and more than 10,000 square kilometer, the number of patches and total, the number of patches, the total area under such patches definitely increases. So we have very large chunk of forest in Chhattisgarh, Madhya Pradesh and Odisha which is connected. Whereas in case of Maharashtra, most of the forest is in between or below 10 square kilometer of forest patch size. So we have large fragmentation happening in Maharashtra. But to the contrary, when it comes to protection of the corridor and development of the new protected areas in such corridor, Maharashtra has taken a giant leap. So getting into next part of my presentation, role of new PAs in connectivity. So all the state governments have been in different capacities declaring new PAs and getting them into framework of even tiger reserves also. These new PAs, they help us as a source in fragmented landscape. For example, towards northern side of the Tadoba Tiger Reserve, we have developed new protected area like Ghodazari, which is again another source area in fragmented landscape of Brahmapuri Forest Division. Then it can act as, this new protected area can act as an intermediate stop between two distant sources. Take example of Tadoba Tiger Reserve in Maharashtra and Kawal Tiger Reserve in Andhra Pradesh. So this Telangana, these two tiger reserves are far distantly spaced. So whenever tigers are moving, I'm sure Kannadagaon sanctuary, which is declared recently by the state government, it acts as a intermediate stop, or rather we can say as a intermediate source population also. So maybe tiger in a one generation and in two generation can move from the one place to one source area to another source area. Again, new PA can act as a nuclei for the future tiger reserve also. For example, Boar Tiger Reserve in Maharashtra. So it began with small boar sanctuary, and then it expanded as a new boar sanctuary, and thereafter extension to the new boar sanctuary. So that's how it begins, even with the small protected area also. We have been upgrading PA areas to tiger reserve areas, like large PA, like recently means few years before Navegaon Nagzira Tiger Reserve, it was declared as Navegaon Nagzira National Park and Sanctuary was declared together as Tiger Reserve years before, and it is having good tiger population right now, breeding tiger population, I should say, right now. Likewise, such huge protected areas, potential protected areas are also there. For example, of Navradehi Wildlife Sanctuary in Madhya Pradesh, which can be declared as a tiger reserve, which can support a viable tiger population. Likewise, we can declare, or we have already declared, small PAs as satellite core. Take example of Fane Wildlife Sanctuary in the northern part of Kanha Tiger Reserve. It's just highly connected to Kanha Tiger Reserve. It can be declared as a satellite core of Kanha Tiger Reserve. Many times we use this bargain during wildlife clearance, having a condition of declaring new area or additional area as protected area or tiger reserve area. For example, Ratapani and Navradehi was a bargain as to be declared as a tiger reserve in this one, diamond mining case in Panna Tiger Reserve. Ken Betwa linking case in Panna Tiger Reserve. Then we take sufficient efforts in expanding our existing TRs to the connectivity areas by declaring adjoining area as protected area, and then core. We can take example of Navegaon Nagzira Tiger Reserve. The adjoining connecting area was declared subsequently as Nagzira Wildlife Sanctuary to New Nagzira Wildlife Sanctuary, and then again another Koka Sanctuary, and this all area was integrated into one tiger reserve to expand it. We also do not only of the core but of buffer also, expansion of buffer also, and then unified control of the buffer is given to the field director. So he is having whole control of core area as well as buffer area. For example, Rukhad area recently was integrated into Pench Tiger Reserve, which is again a connectivity patch between Pench Tiger Reserve and Kanha Tiger Reserve. Now, over a map, we can see some recently declared protected areas or tiger reserves or potential areas which can brought into network of PAs, which will aid into connectivity for the tiger. So Bandhavgarh is a very good source population in central India. Recovery of Sanjay Dubri is happening, and there is definitely movement of also from the source population like Bandhavgarh into Sanjay Dubri Tiger Reserve. Unfortunately, Guru Ghasidas being potential area to be declared as tiger reserve, it is yet waiting the approval and consent from the state government. As we move away from the Guru Ghasidas, there is again Tamur Pingla and Samarsot Wildlife Sanctuary, which is again connecting to the Palamu Tiger Reserve. So if these areas are integrated into tiger reserve and management is brought in the line or aligned with the tiger conservation, definitely this is going to be one of the largest connected patch of forested patch for the tiger conservation. As we move next, Balaghat, Rajnandgaon and Kavardha area, all this is territorial area towards south of the Kanha Tiger Reserve, connecting to Navegaon Nagzira Tiger Reserve. It is, I mean, the way we have seen the rising small protected areas around Tadoba Tiger Reserve, similar thing can happen even in this area also, because this area is having one of the highest density of tiger. It is comparable with the high density tiger reserves area also, even outside tiger reserve. But then, as earlier speakers have said, like this is area which is giving a lot of revenue to the state government and employment to the local population. Their dependency is a lot. So not going to be a easy thing, but it is definitely a potential area for declaring new tiger reserve. And as we move,
sorry, just to jump in here, you have a minute or so.
Yes. So likewise, we have areas between Tadoba and Indravati Tiger Reserve, huge chunk of areas, huge ocean of forest, I should say, which is already getting integrated into tiger conservation by means of having several new protected areas like Umred Karandla, like Ghodazari, like Kanadgaon Sanctuary. And we definitely have some areas that recently there was a proposal from the Madhya Pradesh government for declaring 10 new protected areas, 2 of which Mahatma Gandhi and Rajendra Prasad is falling between connectivity of Satpura Tiger Reserve and Melghat Tiger Reserve. Likewise, areas between Tipeshwar and Kawal. Tipeshwar definitely has significance to be declared as Tiger Reserve. There are areas between Simlipal and Satkushia Tiger Reserve like Hadgad and Kuldia sanctuaries, which can be declared as new tiger reserves. So that's all from my side, and I would like to thank many people, those who have helped me in getting this presentation ready by providing their input and material. And thanks for your patient listening. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
No, thank you. That's fantastic. It's always great to see what's going on and the conversation about new protected areas, upgrading protected areas. We'd like to turn this now to a question and answer session for each of the 3 presenters. And so I'd ask the presenters to turn on their videos and then mute and unmute yourself based on the questions. Now we're getting the questions that are being curated from the audience. And I'd like to begin with you, Jay. This is about reconciling essentially your maps, the one map that rules them all, of which you said it's not really that at all, with the current understanding of corridors like Hemant just presented now, and how much degree of variance there are between these 2 essentially data sets.
Yes, that's a great question. Yeah, I hope that joke was well taken. That it certainly is not the one to rule them all. That, like I said, this is it was really an effort to take the hard science that goes into building some of these maps from different groups that are all using different methodologies and different data inputs that go in. So the maps might look a little bit different, but what can we say from all of them? And so we hope that that'll just be a part to contribute to further refining these maps that are used by the government, or to compare and see, all right, this also agrees to this degree. We know these corridors are important. These ones we may need to look into a little bit more. But we also really want to stress the importance of validating our results further. And like I said, especially using telemetry data, possibly looking at some of the dispersing individuals that Hemant mentioned, things like that can really help confirm, to the best of our ability, try to validate these corridors that we're proposing. But we want to stress that it's not about pitting anything like, this group says this group says this. We really want to say, okay, what can we gather from all of this research that's done such an amazing job? All the data is valid, all of it's been published, all of it's important. What can we gather from that to give the best deliverables to managers and decision makers?
While we have you here, just real quickly as an add-on to that, Jay, you talked about validation. What's the genetic information out there? I mean, scat, hair. I mean, don't we have some DNA that can confirm some of this information?
Yeah, so with there's the route that genetics has gone in the last 15, 20 years is incredible. So you can get a large amount of DNA from scat, from hair, but the most you can get is from if you have blood samples and things like that. We didn't have any genetic information to validate with these studies. The studies that did use genetic data use them to kind of build the resistance maps and identify how we think these populations have connected in the past based on how related these populations are genetically. And so we wouldn't be able to validate with that since we already used it to kind of compare and to create these maps. And so if there is external genetic data available, that would be another great way to look at it. The one thing I will say is with genetic data, it's going a little bit farther in the past. And so you're looking at how these populations connected, 15 to 30 years back and even more. If you get genomic data from blood samples, you can maybe look at it on a shorter time scale. But I think the movement data is the most valuable in terms of validating this in real time.
Thank you, Jay. Amrita, while the point on local livelihoods and resource dependency on corridor areas is well taken, but is community management a feasible option to protect corridor areas, or should they have a more restrictive tenurial provision given threats like mining?
Mm-hmm. So I think this has been something that I think a lot about as well. And I think this is one of the cases where we can't go with an either or. This is really dependent on, like I said, parcel by parcel unit of land. So there has to be some form of thinking about, is this particular patch hugely important for livelihoods? Or is this a plantation that's sitting on an ore? If it's a plantation sitting on an ore, how do we manage that between two government arms? If there are 14 villages on that piece of land who use it actively as a source of income, maybe that's a place for co-management. So it will necessarily be patchy. I don't think we can do a ratification of corridors without a use case idea for what could be allowed and what can't be allowed, depending on the use case of that specific corridor. So it will be local and it will be patchy.
And just as a quick follow-up, Amrita, it's fantastic presentations, everyone. Has anyone done any social resistance mapping? I mean, you map these communities, but have you asked these communities if in fact they do represent some kind of barrier, maybe they're more tolerant?
Yeah, so I think that is, again, an active place of research. And I think there are various differences in that. So if you're an intensive agriculturalist, perhaps you're going to be less tolerant to having wildlife come through. If you're someone who has 3 or 4 portfolios of livelihood options, many of which are tuned into forest health, then perhaps you're more tolerant of wildlife being there. I don't know if there's been large-scale studies of this across corridors. I know there's sort of place-based, site-based inferences for management around protected areas, specifically in buffer areas. But I don't know if the further flung corridor areas are seeing that kind of active research. And you're absolutely right. It would be great to get like a resistance map of social perspectives and sort of influence as well.
Thank you, Amrita. Hemant, if you could turn your video, and yes, thank you. What is the most critical policy interventions needed to protect corridors in central India?
So most critical policy interventions, what I think about right now is we are having plenty of linear infrastructure developments coming up in this one corridor areas, and these infrastructures, these developments, they get to know, or they get into this one forest clearance case towards the end of this one. Their planning is done, approval is done, and then DPR is made and everything. After that, it comes for the clearance of forest department or wildlife clearance. So the most at that time, accommodating any new suggestion, it becomes difficult for the user agency. So if we have some kind of a mechanism wherein all these such kind of developments which are coming in corridor area are planned properly in the beginning itself, whether to go ahead with such projects or not, or if we need to go ahead, then how do we should go ahead about it, or what mitigations measures should we have in place. If that is happening at the topmost level, in the inception of project level, through some policy guidelines, then that would be a wonderful thing. That I think is a major policy, that would be major policy intervention.
Just as a follow-up, Hemant, you presented the least cost paths and the circuitscape assessment that's led to a lot of this decision-making from a study in 2010. We've just heard from Amrita and Jay about, new information. How is this all combined? What's the process of combining new information so that you guys can have, the Tiger Authority can have, the best information available to make management decisions?
Right. So these circuitscapes and least cost pathways are already in place. The report is being communicated to the state governments, and we have been taking input from this coming up new All India Tiger estimation exercises also to have fine tuning into it. One example what I would like to share with you is how new information can be integrated into this existing layers is the corridor mapping of Tadoba Tiger Reserve and subsequent inclusion of that corridors into Tiger Conservation Plan was done with the help of Wildlife Conservation Trust. So they did not only on ground study, but fine scale GIS appraisals of these areas, and all information available about tiger mortality or human kill or any such tiger evidences. including tiger collaring data, and that information along with this one, the modeling they use, that was integrated into tiger conservation plan of a particular tiger reserve. So there is a huge scope by having a collaborative work with concerned state government or this one individual tiger reserve.
Thank you, Hemant. I'd like to go back to Amrita quickly. Amrita, nice synthesis of all the stakeholders in the landscape. Some of them have conflicting interests.
Yes.
What role do you envision for NCCI to facilitate a middle path in this situation?
Okay, so I think that's a great question. And again, I think it's more dependent on the approach. And so one of the things I think NCCI does pretty well is it provides a space for people to have a non-judgmental conversation. And a non-judgmental conversation, I think, is the beginning of collaborating or even understanding each other's perspective. And so in that, I think we've had in the past invitees to CILS from the National Highways Authority in India. And so it might be one of those cases where we can get the stakeholders to at least talk about their processes. And like Hemant was saying, maybe we find a fix in the framework. Maybe, we find something like, oh, EIA has come too late in the pipeline of a project. How do we work with all the stakeholders to make sure they don't have to repeat their work or have to start over once you start building, or put in a mitigation structure once you already had your plans made? Or how do we talk about things like avoidance, given a planning platform? And so that, I think, is really key. I think there are spaces now, Gary. There's Niti Aayog, which is a specific place for interdepartmental planning. There's the Planning Commission at the very high level. And then at the local levels, there's also this really interesting idea where really poor districts, or backward districts as they were called before, have been renamed aspirational districts. And so it's really in the governmental framework, there is now a foot in the door to be able to talk about what do the people in a district that has very little apart from forest livelihoods, what are their plans, and how do you manage something like they need a highway, they need irrigation, alongside the goals for conservation. So I think it's going to be slow, it's going to be laborious, but it's going to be worthwhile to go in that direction versus all of us honing into what we love doing best.
Thank you. Jay, I have a question from you. You seem to have cropped out the northern limit of the landscape, the Panna Tiger Reserve. Is that just an anomaly?
It's a great observation, and we were sorry to have to do that, but it was really an artifact of taking the common extent from all of our studies. We made a decision to we tried to look at areas that several of the studies were covering, but not all of them, and it just made the analytics really difficult. And so what we did is we still, if you remember the maps, we still have a small piece of Panna coming in the very top, so that we could map movement and connectivity to and from that area, but it doesn't look like it's in the map. But we did insert something there, basically a buffer around Panna, so it would go into our extent. So it technically is still included in terms of movement going towards it, but not to the extent that we would have liked. But once again, it was nothing against Panna, obviously. When we took the common extent from everything, that was what we were left with.
Thank you for doing that. Hemant, I have a question. Yes. I have two questions for you here.
Yes, please.
Are there any efforts for interstate cooperation for transboundary conservation of and management of tiger corridors?
Definitely there are efforts. NTCA provides technical assistance to the state governments by means of even standard operating procedures also. We have standard operating procedure for the interstate coordination, and specific actions are laid out there. We had meetings even with the intervention from the NTCA or on state boundary state governments on themselves for enhancing the protection and conservation of such corridors.
Thank you. And we have a question here. What are the prospects for connectivity in Odisha?
Odisha.
Correct.
Odisha is having two tiger reserves. One is Simlipal Tiger Reserve and another one is Satkoshia Tiger Reserve. We don't have any tigers left in wild as per our recent records in Satkoshia Tiger Reserve. However, the genetic pool of tigers in Simlipal Tiger Reserve is very unique, and they are breeding well. Their population is rising, and we definitely imagine that once the population in Simlipal Tiger Reserve is recovering, definitely it will go to Hathgad, and one another sanctuary is there in Keonjhar Wildlife Division. So that connectivity is there between Satkoshia and Simlipal Tiger Reserve, but then functional connectivity is not yet observed. However, we have some protected areas like Debrigad in the border of Chhattisgarh and Odisha, and we have connectivity between Chhattisgarh and Odisha, interstate connectivity between these two. Along with that, we have Udanti Sita Nadi Tiger Reserve and Sunabeda proposed Tiger Reserve, which is in Odisha. Udanti Sita Nadi Tiger Reserve in Chhattisgarh, and we have tiger movement between these two adjoining protected areas. But for the recovery of Satkoshia Tiger Reserve, probably rather than waiting for a long full-fledged tiger recovery program which was ongoing, and it couldn't yield the results up to the mark, so that may be the only option, is because it doesn't have any nearby source area, strong source area.
Thank you very much. Amrita, you get the last question.
Great.
How much forest is being diverted in the corridor areas, not the whole state, for central India for linear infrastructure?
Right. So this is again really good information from LIFE, which is the legal or political think tank in Delhi, and they collect a lot of this information and compile these good reports of where the data on forest diversions, which I showed a little bit of. I'll actually show one more slide that I had on this, which I removed, but I can show it here. Right. So in the three states that I looked at, I didn't look at Jharkhand and Odisha, but you can see that roads is clearly one of the places where a lot of forest is being diverted. Irrigation as well. And this is down to the districts that are in the corridors. So this is not all across the state. This is only in the corridors where these forest diversions have happened, because we asked for that data and they were forthcoming with it as well. This is LIFE. And so you'll see that it is, if we were to just focus on two things in the upcoming years, maybe it would just be linear infrastructure and the amount of forest that's being diverted in corridor spaces in central India.
Thank you so much. First of all, again, applause to, it's hard with, virtually, but there's a loud roar of applause for all three speakers. Thank you all for these great presentations. I'd like to now move to the panelist session of this morning's conversation on tiger connectivity. And I'd like to introduce our three panelists. And we're going to talk about keeping connectivity a reality for central India. And so we'll have a 30-minute panel with an interactive question and answer. First, I'd like to introduce Dr. Sandeep Tambe from IIFM. Thank you, Professor Tambe, for joining us today. I would like to introduce Sejal Wora, Program Director at World Wildlife Fund India. Hello, Sejal. Thank you for joining us today. And Kishore Rithi, from founder and of course, a key soul of this landscape from the Saputo Foundation. Kishore, thank you. You can turn on your video. And let me introduce the conversation to the panelists. So, and everyone's full of the panelists' bios. Everyone's bios are located on Hubaloo, and please look so you can get more in-depth information about each of our panelists here. So you've just heard the vision, you've heard about the conservation policies, you've heard about the challenges with the coexistence and the humanity and social livelihoods in central India, where we're trying to have a home, a safe place for tigers to coexist with people. So some questions and musings to consider. So Amrija's presentation, it illustrated how corridors in central India are heavily populated with many stakeholders. What policies and managements are required to connect protected areas in this populated landscape that will maintain connectivity over the long term? So a couple things to consider here. Do you think the science is robust enough for planning and conserving corridors? Are there critical questions that the science can address or is not addressing? Could we just translocate one tiger from one reserve, truck them between, protected areas and just save people a lot of hassle? Or how do you view the benefits and difficulties for local communities who live and within these corridors? And basically, the whole idea of this panel is trying to suss out, given what we know now, what's our vision for the future for connectivity in this landscape? I know I presented you with a whole range of issues, but it's really your time to give your perspective on what's going on in central India. And it's a complicated area, but I feel that you guys have enough wisdom to help us sort this out. So I'll let you all have it. Kishore, can you, I think Kishore is coming on, but I'll turn it over to you, Sandeep, if you'd like to begin.
Yeah, thanks, Gary. Yeah, from my experience in Central India, I feel this is a very complex issue in the sense that we have livelihoods, conservation, developmental projects, all going on at the same time. And the sense that I get is, though a lot of research is happening on conservation corridors, typically conservation science is just one of the streams of knowledge that policymakers use when they take these decisions. And just like we heard, many of the decisions on siting of linear projects like irrigation, roads, mining, they take place at a much higher level where these conservation concerns are not factored in. And by the time the Tiger Conservation Authority or the State Forest Departments are asked for those clearances, those decisions are largely made beforehand. So I guess a lot of coordination at the highest level, at the state and the Government of India level, about citing these developmental projects would make a big difference, because I'm sure some alternate options which are less damaging to the corridors can always be thought of, especially when you are on the planning board. The second point regarding livelihoods, my sense is that India is playing a very important role in eradicating poverty, and Indian villages are not those you can say villages which are developing very fast, and not those kind of sleepy villages that we used to imagine in the past. Millions of people have been lifted out of poverty, and though agriculture is intensifying, at the same time we see the hardcore poverty receding more towards the eastern parts of the country, and a lot of non-farm employment, diversification of livelihoods, people migrating is observed in central India. So in that sense, my feeling is that the dependence on forests for livelihood will come down in the days to come, especially because other forms of employment and livelihoods are being made available. So I would also love to hear a lot about, are there possibilities of having options which are a win-win situation? They work for livelihoods, they work for corridors as well. And is there some way we can promote these interventions in these critical corridor areas? I mean, developing more and more protected areas along the corridors is one of the options, but it may not be available all along the corridors. So you have to look at options where people are owning the land. These are community lands or privately owned lands. So what kind of land use we can promote so that there can be a win-win possibility for conservation and livelihoods. So those are some of the models I thought it would be great to know about. And finally, I would just like to add, like I said earlier, science is just one of the streams of knowledge that policymakers use. So using and most of the outputs of science, whether it is journal papers or these conferences that we organize, are just of no use for policymakers. So some more communication and translation would really help them to engage in this debate. Because largely, if you see the communication about tigers in India, we feel that it's a grand success. India has the largest percentage of tigers in the world, and our tiger numbers are growing so fast. So it's like a story where you feel that we are already done so much. India is the leader in the world. It seems as if there's not much that needs to be done. So in that sense, this particular concern about conserving our corridors and the long-term future of our tigers is very important, because this message right now that is there in the popular media is that India's tiger conservation is a huge success. And it kind of hides the real issues that are still remaining in terms of conserving the corridors. Yeah.
So let me just and I apologize. So I want you I want all three of you to interact with each other. We're an audience who's watching your conversation. You've just seen the movie of 3 presentations, and now I want you, based on the presentations and the inputs I've just given you, to now interact with each other based on have a conversation, if you will, and we want to learn from how you are perceiving and your knowledge that you have of this area. Sejal?
Okay, hi, thanks, Gary. Hi, Sandeep, hi, Kishore, hi, everybody. Can you hear me? First, just to check.
Yes.
Okay, great. So, gosh, lots of things to say. First of all, I just want to say that I'm jumping from one workshop to the other, and it was really interesting. The last workshop that I was in, it was an international workshop, and one of the case studies that was presented was from Côte d'Ivoire, if I pronounce it right, in Western Africa, and it was basically German aid agency people who are running, the typical protected area projects there, where they, these sort of aid agencies come in and set up these large parks and tell people in the country, especially the governments of those countries, how they should be running those parks. It was really amazing to see. So they had this map which connected huge chunks of forest. So protected areas in Africa, as you know, are huge compared to the ones we have. They're in the tens of thousands of square kilometers, even hundreds of thousands of square kilometers. And they had this corridor connecting these 2 gigantic protected areas, and the width of the corridor was 500 meters. And this is the model, and this is what they're proposing, and this is what they're investing huge amounts of money on, to set up a protected area system with corridors of 500 meters connecting giant areas of forest with God knows what in between, probably oil palm or something else. But the point that I'm trying to make is that the concept of corridors is still all over the place. If I look at it from the Indian context, our own thinking has evolved and changed over time. But there's still globally, there's all kinds of models of corridors that are being proposed. And I wonder about the science and how well the science is actually spreading in terms of the thinking around corridors. So that was for me a shocker to see that today, to think that there's still these kinds of models that are being proposed. Having said that, you asked about the gaps. So I'll start with the science, and then I'll pick up from Sandeep's thread about the other challenges. So for me, I guess the biggest question that remains, and Amrita brought this up also, is this whole business of the threshold of coexistence. Because we know that in certain areas, there is a higher threshold of coexistence in terms of people and wildlife living together. In other areas, there's a lower threshold. We also know that a lot of wildlife, especially tigers, can negotiate amazing kinds of landscapes. So in terms of corridors, you wonder, the tiger's not going to know that this is a corridor and I have to follow this path. It's going to follow whatever path it takes. So at the end of the day, we've really got to look at coexistence. That's going to be the future. It's not that only in corridors there has to be coexistence. There needs to be coexistence everywhere. It needs to be mainstreamed somehow into the landscape to say that, so what are those thresholds? What is it for wildlife? I mean, what is the red line for wildlife? To say, okay, when the land use change goes into this level, then you've completely blocked movement, whereas certain kinds of land use can still allow permeability. And similarly with people, what is their tolerance level and what is their limit to coexistence. So if we somehow understand that better, then we're able to design systems where you have this larger landscape level kind of hybrid model. I mean, we've been talking a lot about hybrid models of development, where it doesn't have to be all to one extreme or all people living, on the edge of the forest on subsistence. So somewhere there's, India is rapidly changing. Sandeep said this, aspirations are changing. So how do we mold these aspirations so that people are getting a much better lifestyle, their quality of life is improving, but not necessarily in the same way that, you would think of it otherwise, where it completely transforms the landscape. So is there a way to find this hybrid model of development? And if you were to ask me about the future of the landscape, something like that, where there is a hybrid model where, there is permeability, where people are living with wildlife, where there is agriculture that is remunerative and good for people, but not completely transforming the landscape. So we need to find that, we need to somehow find that middle ground. And I think, one way to do it. So again, I'd go back and agree with Sandeep that what we are seeing is actually pressures on forests in many areas are decreasing. I'm seeing this where I live in Uttarakhand in the hills. Lots of people are migrating out to cities. You're seeing actually better regeneration today than ever before. People have switched to LPG. They've reduced number of cattle for various reasons. I'm not going to go into all the social reasons for it, but we do see recovery happening. To me, the bigger threat to corridors and to the landscape is really from the large scale infrastructure. Today, the big challenge is that, and those are much more powerful interests. And it is much more tricky and much more difficult to deal with that level of land use change and transformation than it is to deal with communities. And so we have to shift our focus to say, how are we going to deal with this? And the only way to deal with that, I think, is we've got to, of course, provide the technological solutions which exist. But otherwise, we've got to try and mainstream biodiversity thinking into development planning. Because if we are not going to do that, then it's always going to be that outlier that Sandeep mentioned, that plans are already made and then you're trying to somehow integrate biodiversity. Impossible. It's never going to happen. So how do we change the thinking to say that biodiversity values have to be integrated into the process at the beginning? And I think every effort, whether it is scientific effort, economics, I think we all need to get together to change that language, because we have not been able to sell biodiversity. We have not been able to sell biodiversity conservation to the planners and the developers. And we've got to find a means to do that. And to me, the science of corridors and all that is fine. But if we want to transform and want some transformative change in this whole process, then we've got to make biodiversity valuable to the developers. Unless we do that, we are going to be struggling, a losing battle. I have lots more to say, but I'll stop here for the time being.
Kishore?
Yeah. Hi, Gary.
Hi, Kishore. It's great to see you. I hope you can respond. You're a man of the landscape here. These are folks who come from the outside.
Thanks, Gary. Gary, I would just respond to what you said, how we can actually transform this science into actions on ground. And that's very important, because whatever has been presented today by Jay and Amrita and Hemant means we need to bring synergy in all these aspects. And what I see on ground is really I'm very optimistic about the situation. And many things are happening, positive things are happening, which we need to build upon at one place, and then we need to replicate them across the Central Indian landscape. So I would just give one example of a very senior forest officer who asked me the question after a State Board for Wildlife meeting. He said, you people are fighting for declaring some protected areas in the corridors where the distance between two tiger reserves is quite large. So what you can do, you can just declare the entire Vidarbha landscape as protected area instead of just declaring it in small bits and pieces. So I responded, I said, look, we are not just arbitrarily asking you to notify any protected area, but it's based upon science, and what Amrita J and Hemant has presented today is actually followed by the State Board for Wildlife in Maharashtra. And that's what is expected. So Hemant has already given a lot of examples of protected areas newly declared in Maharashtra, especially in Vidarbha landscape. So I think we definitely need to use these presentations in the entire Central Indian landscape and make the state governments feel that the conservationists are not just demanding new protected areas arbitrarily. It is based upon science, and we need to really think about them. Now, saying so, I would just like to reiterate what Jay has said. There is a lower agreement in agriculture areas and settlements in the corridor, and highest agreement in the near the protected areas. So I definitely agree upon this. But how can we bring larger, moderate or high level of agreement in the human settlements and agriculture fields in the corridor? And that's what is something which is very important right now. And nothing can come just by declaring corridor. Things can really happen if you also attach some incentives to locals, because Amrita has very well said that these are the two important stakeholders: the farmers, the village settlements, and though they are lower density, lower population villages, but still you need to provide incentives. And one example I would like to quote here: Maharashtra government has issued one GR on the Dr. Shama Prasad Mukherjee Janvan Yojana, Development Yojana. So it's in English, it's about the sustainable development of villages which are falling in the corridors. Now that's present in the Maharashtra, but it's absent in the Madhya Pradesh. So we need to see how we can work with the Madhya Pradesh government to bring similar kind of scheme in Madhya Pradesh in tiger corridors. Now, why it is important? Because we need to spend, we need money. We need money in the corridor, in the villages, falling in the corridors. And that's happening in Maharashtra, but not happening in Madhya Pradesh. Second, we must remember that we don't want to, like Hemant has said, that we don't want bigger tiger reserves coming up in the corridor, and we don't want to lure the animals in the corridor. But one must keep in mind that our protected area size is very small. And let's remember the roadmap set up by the NTCA. And it has very well said that your tiger reserve size means 4 of the tiger reserves should be 800 to 1000 square kilometer. Let's find out how many tiger reserves, which Amrita has shown in Central Indian landscape, has got this geographical area, 800 to 1000 square kilometer. And the distance between two tiger reserves, like NNTR to PTR and NNTR to Kawal Tiger Reserve, or Tadobandhari Tiger Reserve to Kawal Tiger Reserve. And if this distance is large, the tiger reserve size is small, definitely we should go for expansion of the protected areas. Now, while saying so, we definitely have some wildlife potential areas in between the corridors. And that's where I again give one example of a very good scheme of Madhya Pradesh government. They are not talking about the resettlement of some strategic villages from the core, but they are also talking about the resettlement of strategic villages from the buffer areas. That's what is available in Madhya Pradesh, but similar kind of scheme is absent in Maharashtra. So I think Maharashtra government has to learn from the Madhya Pradesh government and replicate this particular scheme. So that's about this resettlement of villages, and then we can definitely have more inviolate areas and fulfill the requirements of the roadmap, which is shown by the NTCA. I have already addressed the issue of livelihood, because in the entire landscape, and especially in the corridors, one must remember that we need to, our conservation model should take care of the livelihoods of the people, and we should provide more and more livelihood opportunities to villagers. And there Maharashtra government has, and especially addressing Jay's presentation, because he said lower agreement on the agriculture fields and human settlements. So Maharashtra government has already issued one GR on conservancies. Now here, if the farmers who who are facing a lot of crop depredation issue in the corridors, and want to just give up those areas, keep those areas reserved for the wild animals. I'm talking about the private areas. And if that happens, Maharashtra government has already issued the GR, and they are working on this. They have already identified two areas to make it happen. Whereas Madhya Pradesh government need to issue similar kind of GR, so that they can also go in this direction of notifying conservancies in the corridors. We don't want protected areas in the corridors, but we can definitely accommodate local farmers and provide them better incentives just for keeping their lands for wild animals. So that's what I think these three GRs mainly address these concerns. And one last point which I would like to explain here about linear infrastructure. How are we going to address this particular issue? And as Hemant rightly said, that this need to be addressed at the DPR stage, not once the project already approves and then work is already commissioned, and then you talk about the mitigation measures. That actually delays the whole project, and the cost is also built up very high. So Maharashtra government and in the State Wildlife Board, we have taken a decision, and I was in the standing committee NBWL. That time we started the discussion. Maharashtra government started working on it, and today, thanks to government of Maharashtra, who has already set up a separate committee to deal with this issue. And not only one committee, there are two committees. One committee is the executing committee, and they have already started working with all the development agencies like irrigation, the MSCDCL, which deals with the transmission lines, the highway authority, National Highway Authority, the PWD of the state road department, the railways, and they have already given them the task. What are your existing projects? Because they are ready to spend on mitigation measures on proposed projects, because that's a condition NTC and all other policy making bodies are putting. But what about the existing canals? What about the existing transmission lines? Their state government is very reluctant to allocate money. And this committee, then there is a second committee which is actually looking at allocating money for mitigation measures on existing projects. So the first committee has already started working with these agencies which I have just mentioned, and the task has been given that you segregate the work in two parts and come out with the mitigation measures, the strategic locations, etc. And they are coming out with this. Now, the main challenge would be how state government allocate the money. And I think if that happens, Maharashtra has really shown a road ahead. We need to replicate it in the entire landscape.
Thank you, Kishore. Let me ask Sandeep and Sejal if they can respond, if possible. Thank you. Sandeep, I see you're up. Sejal?
I kind of found it very interesting in terms of the Kishore, the initiatives that the Maharashtra government has taken. So in terms of the NTCA, their priorities are more to get more and more protected areas in the corridors. So they are looking at more legally sound areas which could cover more and more corridors. And while you are saying that where farmers are voluntarily giving up their land, and they are being some way facilitated by the state government, which you are calling as conservancies. So what do you think are the pros and cons of developing more and more protected areas in existing forest lands versus at the same time thinking of conservancy? So I think these two ideas are both sound very interesting to me. I would be interesting to know how these conservancies are happening. I mean, what is it for the farmers? How much is the government investing? So I would be interested to know more about this.
Yeah, Sandeep, I think you have raised two issues, and both of them are coming at different locations. First is notification of new protected areas. Now, and the expansion of existing protected areas. Now, where it is happening in especially in Maharashtra, means Vidarbha landscape. The expansion of existing protected areas is happening in tiger bearing areas. Like Pench Tiger Reserve was only 256 square kilometer, and we added one more protected area, Mansingh Dev, of 280 square kilometers. Now, Pench Tiger Reserve, Maharashtra has become almost 450 square kilometer. So we are expanding existing tiger reserves at a strategic location. Like Hemant has said, given the example of NNTR, Navegaon Nagzira Tiger Reserve. There used to be only Nagzira Wildlife Sanctuary. Now the government has notified Poka Wildlife Sanctuary and New Nagzira Wildlife Sanctuary and then declared a tiger reserve. So now total area is around 600 square kilometer in Navegaon Nagzira. So we are looking for new protected areas like Ghoda, Jhari and all. If you look at their locations, so they are very close to existing tiger reserves, and the distance between two tiger reserves like the Tadoba Andhari Tiger Reserve and Pench Tiger Reserve is quite far, or Navegaon Nagzira Tiger Reserve is quite far. So you need to look at some potential area in between and declare it as sanctuary. So there we are going for the sanctuary. Now, when you talk about the conservancies, it's the corridor area where people face a lot of crop damages and lot of problems from carnivores. So livestock losses are more, the crop depredation is more, and if you look at the compensation ex gratia paid to them, it's huge. So there we are looking for the conservancy model. So both of these are coming at different locations. So conservancy process has not gone ahead, but the government resolution has been already issued. So that's a big thing. And the incentive that government has provided, it is not very lucrative right now. Incentive provided for the resettlement, village resettlement is really lucrative in Maharashtra, and that's why more and more villagers are ready for the voluntary resettlement. That's not true about the conservancy right now, and that's why that might be one of the reasons why it is not picking up in Vidarbha landscape. Yes,
Sejal, you get the last word in this part of our session. Let me just let the audience know that we've now just had a conversation of our three panelists, but we want you to have questions and answers to the panelists themselves. So we're going to expand the conversation with your input for the final 20 minutes of our session here. So Sejal, in this part, you have the last word in responding to Kishore or Sandeep.
Okay, so I will, I think, well, I agree and disagree. So, so let me put that forward. I think, you know, we're going to need multiple pathways. There will be requirement for, there's no silver bullet, right? There's no fun size fix all to say that this corridor and here's a corridor management plan and therefore everything is going to go according to plan. We're going to have to, and I think Amrita said this nicely about the localized solutions. So every situation is going to need a very localized solution. India is in that way unique. You know, the corridors in central India are no different in terms of pressure and complexity than anywhere else. So just as we are finding multiple pathways and multiple solutions everywhere, we'll have to do the same here. The only, I mean, my concern or caveat or whatever is that, you know, increasing protected areas is sometimes a double-edged sword. Because if you go for that model and people are going to say, okay, fine, you've got your protected areas, now we can do whatever we want outside those protected areas. So you deal with those protected areas, then we'll do mining, we'll do this, we'll do that, we'll compensate, we'll, you know, X, Y, Z. So I think we need to be a little bit careful on this pathway of saying, let's protect more and more areas, because then you're opening the door for other forms of land use outside those PAs. We all know the contentious debates going on around eco-sensitive zones. People just don't want them. I mean, every ESZ committee we go to, states are proposing 0 ESZ or 500 meters ESZ, which makes a mockery of the whole process. But they do that because they feel that protected areas are already there. So why should we, do anything more. So which is why I'm harping on this idea of larger landscapes, which are actually, sort of compromise. If you want to call it a compromised landscape, call it a compromised landscape, but you'll never get 100% of what you want. So let's protect what we can, but also let's ensure that whatever is outside those PAs is also something which is not completely drastically a hard edge. We need to have softer edges so that, the purpose of corridors is served by those softer edges. To me, corridors are nothing but soft edges which allow, wildlife to move from one area to another. So how do we create a landscape if you have this larger vision, which is not just protected areas and unprotected areas, but protected areas with soft edges and a development model which is more conducive to conservation. So that's the pathway that I would look for, is to say let's try and find that kind of model, and that exists in some other parts of the world, and we need to look at that rather than going for the hard-edged PA non-PA kind of a model. So that's my take on it. And one way to do it again was brought up. We need to look at the interests of different stakeholders. And we need to be able to talk to the interests of different stakeholders, because if we don't talk to their interests and we're talking against their interests, it's never going to work. So if we have aspirational districts, how do we build in conservation into aspirational district plans? We have the SDGs. Many governments have called us and said, okay, we are now reaching that stage where SDGs are going to be reviewed next year. So they are in a bit of a panic mode to say, we need to now report back on SDGs. So it's a great opportunity for us to insert environmental issues into the whole state planning process, because they are being pushed on that. So we need to look at all these multiple opportunities to see how do we insert conservation into the agenda of all these different agencies, whether it's the irrigation department, or whether it's the rural development department, or indeed the forest department. Let's look at these multiple options and opportunities. And I feel that as conservationists, we often tend to talk either to ourselves or to partners who think like us. We are not tuned in to talk to people who don't think like us. So I again go back to this issue. We need to learn to talk to people who are not like us. We need to learn to convince people who don't think like conservationists. And unless we're able to do that, we're going to be fighting a lonely battle of trying to protect inch by inch, kilometer by kilometer, small areas. So let us learn this language, which is about convincing the unconvinced, because otherwise, we're just fighting a lonely battle.
Well, we're not alone here. In fact, we have an audience, and so who are very positive on what you're all saying. I want to thank the panelists at this point for this important conversation, and now we're just going to open up to some more general questions and answers. So I have a question here for Sandeep. And of course, Kishore and Sejal, you can respond as well. How can we see community-based institutions like BMCs, and someone please tell me what a BMC is if you can, Sandeep, as institutions for integrating livelihoods and co-managing biodiversity conservation together? Specifically, how do we develop markets and India's social capital in eco-sensitive areas like corridors?
Yeah, thanks, Gary. So these are the biodiversity management committees which are mandated under the National Act. So every local body is supposed to make them. So other than this, there are, several other institutions at the village level. In fact, there is a huge diversity of them. Having said that, but there are very few who are organic, strong, sustainable, who can actually be called as democratic institutions, who have the authority to control and to decide. Many of these are controlled by larger departments or bodies, and you can't really, we still haven't seen a large scale growth of organic village-based institutions in the country. And that is one of the limitations we have in trying to embed conservation at the grassroots level. We typically have to go through centralized agencies to reach the grassroots. Having said that, one initiative that I am pretty much happy to see is these women collectives that you see in almost every part of India. And you see them forming these self-help groups and then doing some economic activities, sharing, lending, fighting their struggles. And then they are federating at the Gram Panchayat level, at the cluster level, at the block level. And I see a whole movement happening through women collectives in various parts of rural India. Very strong bodies, downward accountable and democratic. and doing some kind of income generating activities as well, helping each other at times of need. So I feel there is a lot of strength in these women collectives that I see when I go to the villages. And instead of the other bodies like we talked of, like the Joint Forest Management Committee or the Biodiversity Management Committees, these are more organic and strong institutions with lot of democracy and transparency and accountability. So I feel these can be some of the institutions we can build on for any initiative at the grassroots level, because they seem to be the voice of the people in a few words. So yeah, that is my experience of uh, identifying the institution that this landscape initiative could actually build on, the power of the women collectives in rural India.
Sejal or Kishore, would you like to respond to the question itself, or I can go on?
I can respond to Sandeep in just 2 sentences. I completely agree. I mean, I honestly could not agree more that this is probably the only institution at the village level that I would have, I would say is strong, empowered, and possibly also thinks about the environment, because it's the women who are, most engaged in most of the activities which are linked to forests today. The men have completely disassociated from a lot of that, and actually, you do find in the villages, at least in the villages where I've been moving around, quite a deep divide actually in the values of the women and the values of some of the men who are basically looking at infrastructure, roads, becoming contractors, cutting the forest, all of that kind of stuff, like making a quick buck, whereas the women are the ones who are holding it all together. So I just want to strongly agree with Sandeep on that.
I agree with Sandeep, but just want to add something into this. He spoke about the biodiversity management committees and the joint forest management committees. So there are overlaps in some of the villages if you talk about the entire corridor. But there are EDCs, eco development committees, especially in the buffer areas of the tiger reserves. And then one more community institution, that's a Forest Right under Forest Right Act. So FRA committee at the village level. So these are the institutions, but I don't see a synergy between them. So there are some issues. Then second issue is funding mechanism to these institutions. If State Biodiversity Board is not allocating enough money for BMCs, then BMCs would be just on a piece of paper. If tiger reserves are not allocating enough money to EDCs, then right now we can look at the NTC allocation on for EDC program. So then that work won't happen. Similar thing has happened about the JFM. State governments have curtailed the funding after World Bank backed off. So that program is also suffering. And FRA is more or less for getting rights over the resources, but hardly anyone talks about management of forest. Very few organizations, NGOs are involved in management of the forest that they have got under FRA. So I think I want to see more synergy between the State Board for Wildlife and State Biodiversity Board and the NTCA and the FRA committees, tribal departments especially.
I have a question here for the panel. India has set highly ambitious targets for restoration under the NDCs. Is there scope to prioritize degraded corridors for this work? I mean, is there room for restoration?
Sejal, you would like to take that one?
If you ask me, I say no. I have a very simple answer. No, the reason why I'm saying that is it's actually quite difficult in India. We've tried several times to look at large-scale restoration initiatives, because there is not just India set the target, but there's a lot of global funding actually available for forest landscape restoration, and many countries are jumping on this bandwagon and getting millions of dollars to do forest restoration. It's very complex in India because the whole land tenure system in India is so complicated that finding large areas of land where you're just going to go and start planting trees is easier said than done. it becomes you have to negotiate a whole minefield of who owns the land, who's going to manage it, what will it mean if you plant trees, how will ownership get transferred, what will be the perception of the communities, will they be on board, will they not be on board, what was the previous use of this land, are you converting grazing land into forests, are you, there's a hajar sorry, not hajar, 1,000 different permutations and combinations that stymie you when you think about land degradation restoration. I think what we need to look at is agricultural lands, and mining areas. So these are the areas where actually there is scope for large scale restoration, is mining areas that have been degraded and left because actually the mining companies are not following their own guidelines of restoring those areas when mines are abandoned or finished, and also degraded agricultural lands because of the overuse of chemicals. You have a large amount of agricultural areas which are degraded. So these are the two areas I think where we could look at restoration, but again you've got to look at the whole complexity of the tenurial things. This thing about degraded forest land. I mean, Sandeep, you jump into that, please, because I don't buy that very much. So
one possible example where we can learn how to do restoration in private lands is reviving rivers has received a lot of political priority, and there is huge amount of funds that are being invested in creating forest stands on either side of rivers. Big investment from state government, from the National Mission for Clean Ganga, and possibly there are a lot of lessons for us to see how they were able to implement these large-scale afforestation programs on private lands and use public money for it. So possibly there are some lessons on how these programs performed, what are the learnings for us, what went well, what didn't work well. And these are possibly very few examples where over the last 5 years, large amounts of public funds have been invested in creating these reforestation around rivers on both sides.
So I'll just jump in there, Sandeep,
please.
Because if you talk to our rivers team, they are horrified by this, because basically a lot of floodplains are getting converted into forests, and the wrong types of species are being planted compared to what the floodplain vegetation was, which is very unique. So yeah, they're absolutely, it's happening and it's working because there's so much of money being pumped into it and the state governments are all on board. But there is an issue here with, we are converting one type of land habitat or ecosystem into another type of ecosystem. So yeah, concerns.
Sandeep, I totally agree with what you said, but in the context of CILS, I think I must give this example. Today, Hemant has shown his presentation, and I saw absence of dispersal from Pench Tiger Reserve to Satpura Tiger Reserve. And when I started the work, that time tigers used to disperse from Satpura, Pench to Satpura, Pench, Madhya Pradesh to Satpura Tiger Reserve. And there was a very good connectivity. And while I was in the standing committee NBWL, there were proposals coming for mining operations in the corridor. And now today you see this map, which Hemant has shown. I think these are the priority areas where we should definitely pull these resources and restore these areas back. There are abandoned mines also, but nobody talks about the restoration of those mines. So we should be specific, specifically talking about this particular area. And these are some of the priority areas. I think some other networks are also talking about the priority areas in the Central Indian landscape. I think I agree with what Sandeep has said, but we need to be very specific about bringing the funds and then conducting eco restoration projects in the specific areas. Thank you.
I have a question here. Okay, Sejal, you said we can't, we can't live in our echo chamber. We have to talk to other constituencies. Okay, so how do we do this? Do the panelists know folk and other stakeholder groups that we should be reaching out to, and what stops them, or how can we encourage them from joining in this Central Indian Landscape Symposium for a conversation? I mean, this whole community exists to try to reach to others. How do we do this better?
We have to talk their language, whether we like it or not. Okay, I hate to say this, but Yeah, and we have to soften ourselves a little bit, and we have to be prepared for compromise, and we have to be prepared that we may not get 100% of what we want. But if we want these guys on board, we've got to make them see what's in it for them, right? And then find that end goal which is common. So again, it's about this thing about different values and different priorities, but somewhere there is a common ground. So, we do this a lot in training, and Sandeep knows this, when we do training on conflict management and stuff, we always say, look for the common ground and then work backwards from that. So you start by looking at what do we have in common? It'll be somewhere far away. But once we found that, then you work backwards to say, so what's going to bring them to the table? If we are going to talk about corridors and connectivity and tiger genetics and stuff, it's not going to bring them to the table. But if we are going to talk about a vision for the development of the Central India landscape and the future development and economics and stuff, they'll come to the table. So I think we've just got to also change our own language and bring them in, draw them in, and then take it from there. I don't think there's a set way of doing it, because it also depends so much on individuals. It depends so much on individuals. Sometime back, a few years back, we had the chairman of the National Highways Authority of India, who was a great tiger lover. He'd written books on tigers. Wow, what a better opportunity that the Highways Authority chairman likes tigers, because that's the time when we move, we make up in some movement. But I think one of the things that we're not very good at is being opportunistic. So, we have lots of long-term plans and visions, but this idea of, right place, right time, right person, when we've been able to influence or move larger policy issues, it's been when that has been aligned. So you need to look for that alignment, right person, right time, right situation, and then you should be ready with the right information. And it's very rare that all of that aligns, but when it does align, then the shift comes. So I think what we've got to look for is more and more of those alignments collectively, and as a collective, we should be able to do that, to find those, that when the stars align, things will shift.
Yeah, I too agree that we need more of these conversations with agencies who are taking up development, and we need to align our communication and our translation with policy slogans that aligns with the national priorities, like doubling farmers' incomes, or maybe eradicating poverty in India, housing for all. I mean, some of these national policy statements, we need to catch on to them and try to embed conservation, and that's the way to draw them. So probably more conservation, more communication, and with these development agencies, and also with political representatives who actually play a very key role. So we need to have more conversations with Gram Sabha members, with municipal corporation mayors, with maybe the member of legislative assembly, member of parliaments, and then probably trying to align with the sustainable development agenda, and then try to bring in our concerns as well, and then see where the common ground lies. But probably the first step is trying to start conversation with them.
I totally agree with Sejal and Sandeep in this. And there are many examples when you start this kind of dialogue, what happens. And then not only dialogue, but then actions. And one example I would like to put here, when we were declaring the buffer area of Tadoba Andhari Tiger Reserve, there was huge resistance. Maybe started by initially mining lobby, and then some villages also had opposed to the declaration of buffer. So we reduced the boundary there. And today, after some 10 years, the same villages are asking them to incorporate into the buffer. So buffer should be expanded, and the villages should be part of the buffer. Why this is happening? Because you have shown through actions that if you come join the buffer, then you are the beneficiary. So, and this is not happening with the ESZ, etc., and that's why there is a opposition. And similar examples can be given regarding even infrastructure agencies. One agency, when the irrigation department heard about our heard the presentation, he said, we don't need money. There is a contractor, and he would immediately start working for wildlife, because for wildlife we don't want money, and this contractor would easily do. And he constructed her overpass on irrigation canal in Bor Tiger Reserve. So that's how, if you start dialogue with the different stakeholders, Definitely after 2 years, 3 years, 4 years period, people or stakeholders come out with their own ideas, and these ideas are better than what you thought about initially about the issue.
Our panelists, one last question, and then we have to move on. And I'm sorry, it's a touchy question. It says, interesting that there is talk of inviolate areas by relocating villagers, while allowing climate change impacts, infrastructure development, tourism, and much more to intrude and fragment habitats. When are we going to recognize and make local communities partners in conservation?
Well, I'll jump in because this is exactly what I said. I said it's not the local communities who are, you know, the threat, as it were, but it's all these external forces. And unless we tackle these as well, we have no right really to tell local communities to move out of where they are, while you're allowing other forces to decimate forests at some other corner. So I think it's morally also wrong for us to be just pushing at the level of the communities if we are not already addressing the big picture issues. So I agree with whoever sent that question in, that we need to work. And this is why I talked about multiple pathways, is we need multiple pathways, and we've got to resolve all of these issues, and we've got to take on the powerful interests, because if we don't, then it's a cop-out.
I would like to respond on this, because this is very important question. I would give 2 examples also. See, initially when some road used to be planned, people used to oppose the road, and they used to say that, no, I don't want road through my agriculture area, through my farmland. But today, the best example is Samruddhi Expressway from Mumbai to Nagpur. The land acquisition has been done in a record-break time period. Why? Because they have incorporated all the values into the compensation package. And that's why people are now, they were protesting that why the alignment is going away from my agriculture area? Why not it is going through my farmland? Similar thing is happening about resettlement of villages. When all other aspects which were actually raised by many tribal activists were incorporated into a package, and the state government had declared that package, and now it's been implemented in Maharashtra. So a lot of villages which forest department is not willing to relocate because of their strategy, because of their location, etc. And that's not the priority of the forest department. Still people are agitating to relocate them because the package is very good. And they get all the civic amenities, and that's what is happening. Means Gram Sabha resolutions have been passed. They are protesting Rasta Roko, etc., roadblock, etc. So these are the 2 examples. Means if you talk to the locals and the stakeholders and accommodate them in the policy and planning, they want to be a part of the solution, but we need to provide them opportunities.
Sandeep, the last word.
Yeah, I guess Central India, large parts inhabited by indigenous people, they have a connect with forests, with wildlife. So I think culturally they are on the side of conservation, and in practice as well. So I guess we need to have stronger partnerships with the communities, because in a democracy, that's where the power starts from. So the more support we have from the people, the stronger we will be when we fight the other forces.
So I'm the moderator. I get to ask one question, and the organizers have said I get 1 minute. So if you could answer this quickly. Companies are changing, global companies are changing. They want to source their commodities that are wildlife friendly. They want cotton in India that allow the cotton farmers to grow cotton in a way that allows for tigers to move across their landscapes. Will that change things? Is this kind of behavior and incentives by companies, global companies who are buying products from India, going to change the way we kind of view this issue with coexistence in local communities? Just quickly.
I won't say anything because it's one of our projects, so I'll let Sandeep answer.
Sandeep?
Yeah, I'm not very sure because I mean the areas we are talking of are really remote, and many of them have got very weak markets and very weak demand. These are very remote areas in central India. So I guess we are still to reach that situation where global supermarkets or global chains can influence some of the value chains in these remote areas. But like you said, in many of the other progressive agricultural landscapes of India, might be a possibility. Yeah.
Sure, last word.
Gary, I am born in the cotton growing village in central India, so I can very well explain the situation. So yes, coexistence is possible, and cotton growing means communities are growing cotton in the corridors area, and especially they don't grow cotton in the near the protected areas in the landscape. So cotton growing areas are in the corridors, and definitely they see. Means their interest won't be hampered in the entire tiger conservation initiatives.
I would like to say on behalf of all the organizers of this conversation, the Central Indian Landscape Symposium, thank you for a brilliant conversation, a great deal of wisdom. I'm glad this is recorded because this is just a fantastic opportunity to learn from you all. So from all of us, thank you. To all the speakers in the beginning, I want to thank you as well. This ends our session. I just want to remind you that for tomorrow, we're going to be talking about restoration and livelihoods more in depth, and I hope you will stay tuned. And then on the 30th, you're going to hear about the Coalition for Wildlife Corridors and the National Mission for Human Well-Being and Biodiversity. I am speaking to you from high up from some mountain in the Rockies in the United States. I believe what you're doing is inspirational. Thank you to everyone. And now we'll end, and everyone have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.